Welcome to Amicus, a law review with Jim Santelle, Civic Media's weekly review and discussion of some of the most significant news stories in the areas of law, government, courts, and the aspiration for justice. And now, here's your host, Jim Santelle.
This is Amicus, a law review on the broadcast stations of Civic Media. And my name is Jim Santelle, and I am your host. This hour and also next hour, our 2-hour weekly weekend broadcast, all about the rule of law, about justice, about the aspiration for justice in America and beyond, about things that are important to our lives and livelihoods, especially true this week as we focus once again upon the Department of Justice and the executive branch. We invite you this weekend, as always, in our weekend review of justice-related issues to join in our conversation, be a part of this discussion. You can call in. You can also drop texts into our box at 855-752-4842. That phone number, once again, is 855-752-4842. Along with my terrific producer, Max, here in the studios of Civic Media in Racine, Wisconsin, taking your thoughts, your perspectives, your questions, your inquiries about many things on our aggressive but achievable agenda this weekend, inviting you to participate in our discussion. And yes, indeed, focusing, as we often do, on the issues and events and significant developments coming out of the United States Department of Justice, not just in past years, but especially in this term, as the Department of Justice takes on an entirely new cast, an entirely new approach and atmosphere when it comes to serving you, the American people. And once again, important to underscore, to highlight this notion at the very top of our broadcast this weekend, that the Department of Justice is your Department of Justice. The people, the attorneys, the staff, the investigators, the agents, the paralegals, all the people who are involved in the Department of Justice, yes, indeed, a branch of the executive of the United States of America. Around the cabinet table sits, among others, the Attorney General of the United States of America, but not beholden, not the attorneys of the president. Contrary to what our Attorney General, Pam Bondi, said just on Friday of this past week, in fact, the Department of Justice serving you and advancing the interests of America in pursuit of justice. Significantly, this broadcast, spending most of our first hour, and again, inviting your questions, your comments, your reactions to all of this, necessarily focusing on something that rarely happens in American history. It happened on Friday of this past week, and that is that a president of the United States of America left the White House and took the very brief trip, just a few blocks, down Pennsylvania Avenue, arriving at the Department of Justice located at 9th and Pennsylvania, right along that street where you see the presidents routinely now after inaugurations, not this past time, but routinely walking down Pennsylvania Avenue after they're inaugurated. They pass right by the United States Department of Justice. The Department of Justice, again, a building right there on Pennsylvania Avenue, about halfway between the White House to the west and the Capitol building to the east. This bastion of justice, this place where justice should be considered, meted out, ensured for all Americans. Also the place yesterday where the President of the United States of America, his name is Donald John Trump, appeared in the Great Hall of the Department of Justice and delivered a speech that was unlike anything we have seen before in the many decades since the Department of Justice has had that venue right there on Pennsylvania Avenue. Certainly unprecedented in the history of relations between a president and the Department of Justice ever since the Department of Justice and the Attorney General's office was created way back in 1789 by the Judiciary Act of that time. 1792, Congress made the Attorney General a cabinet-level post. Yesterday, Donald Trump our president visited the Department of Justice. Not unprecedented. It has been done before. It has been done in times when presidents decide that it is appropriate to visit this place, this hallowed, this sacred place of justice in our history and in our present contemporary life, to deliver a speech, talking, as we often do on this broadcast, about the aspirations that he, perhaps one day she, has for America, talking about the reasons why we do justice, why we do criminal prosecution, why we do civil litigation, all of it not animated by any individual, any personal interest, certainly not a part of a retributive attitude toward justice, but to advance the goals and purposes of justice, to ensure that civil rights are enforced, environmental laws are enforced, yes, antitrust laws and tax laws are enforced, that the civil rights that you have under statutes and the Constitution are ensured, and that the people of the Department of Justice understand that they have that role to play independent of the specific direction of a president. Not inappropriate at all, as we have talked at great length in the past, for a president to describe in general terms the things that he anticipates the Attorney General will do during the course of a term of the presidency. Not inappropriate at all, for example, for a president to talk about a focus upon antitrust, business issues, environmental issues, agricultural issues, labor issues, civil rights, human rights issues, national security, public integrity, all kinds of things that animate the Department of Justice in the early part of the 21st century and even long before that. Not inappropriate at all for an attorney general to hear from a president, for all of the U.S. attorneys, all the assistant United States attorneys around the country, all of the professional staff, and yes, indeed, these are civil servants. They're working on your behalf. They do not bring to their daily work a political animus, a political drive of any kind. All of them appropriately, from time to time, hearing from your president about the broad strokes, the broad missions that the president envisions for the Department of Justice, what a president does not do, should not do, has not done, with a couple of rare exceptions, one of them being Donald Trump, the other one being Richard Nixon. What a president does not do is he does not direct an attorney general, assistant United States attorneys, U.S. attorneys to prosecute particular individuals, to go after particular companies civilly or criminally. The specifics are left to the independent judgment, discretion of assistant United States attorneys, and yes, of the attorney general and of the deputy attorney general and of assistant attorneys general responsible for all kinds of things inside the department. To do what? Not to take direction from a department of the president that animates the Department of Justice, but rather to be animated by the law and the facts. To apply the law to the facts and determine whether or not there should be lawsuits filed, criminal or civil. Yesterday, all of that turned on its head. The president initially told through the media sources at the White House that he was going to announce the reinvocation of the statute that, yes, is still out there, invoked just a handful of times in American history, among other things, to support during World War II the horrific, the now generally debunked and rejected notion that Japanese Americans during the Second World War in our nation should be interned in camps, basically prison camps in the western portion of our nation, because we did not trust, apparently, their allegiance and their focus upon the United States of America. American citizens put in prison effectively. Long since put back behind us, told that even the Supreme Court case, Karamatsu, that supported that particular horrific event in our American history has since been rejected. White House telling us that the president was going to announce that he was going to revive that particular statute and invoke it in some ways. He did not do that, which is perhaps the only positive news that comes out of Friday's story of his visit to Main Justice. But he did other things in what are in many ways, a political statement of the sort that we've got used to in his campaigns for the presidency. This was more an attack upon various people with whom he has had disagreements, an attack upon the media, attack upon attorneys, an attack upon former Department of Justice officials, an attack upon anyone who would stand in his way, and calling effectively upon the Department of Justice there in the Great Hall of the Department of Justice, gathered together there to hear the mission, the purpose, the focus of the president calling upon all of the Department of Justice, implicitly and explicitly, to follow his lead. Before we get to the specifics of that and record here, it is important to do so. It is important for all of us to appreciate the horrors of what happened yesterday, even in the nature of words. Yes, indeed, words mean something, as we've often said. Language has meaning. And yesterday, the meanings coming from our president are unmistakable. Before we get to that, let's talk about the setting itself. We've talked in previous broadcasts about the importance of understanding something inside the Department of Justice, about its structure. Where does the Attorney General sit at the top of the Department of Justice? Who is the Deputy Attorney General? Who are these Assistant Attorneys General who operate the various litigating units in the Department of Justice? What about the investigative agencies like the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the U.S. Marshals Service? We've talked all about that. Today, seemingly a bit more superficial, but nonetheless very important because of the important messages that even the architecture of the building conveys, even the building itself conveys. We're going to talk about the building itself there on 9th and Constitution, 9th and Pennsylvania, right there adjacent to the mall in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, the U.S. Department of Justice building, now called the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building. Interestingly and importantly, historically important to note, that it wasn't under the presidency of George W. Bush that the building was renamed in honor of Robert F. Kennedy, who again served as the Attorney General from 1961 to 1964. George W. Bush did that, proclaiming again that this would be the RFK Justice Department. What do we know about the Department of Justice building itself there right on Pennsylvania Avenue? Again, it's the kind of building that you would not necessarily visit. In fact, you really can't visit. It's not on the list of tourist attractions. But it is significant, as I will note, as you walk around that building the next time you're in Washington, D.C., to take a look at the purposeful design of that building and the things that are inscribed outside of the building. Those you can see. And if you are lucky enough to have some reason to go inside, if you make arrangements with someone to come inside the building, you will also note the affirmations of justice inside every single hallway in the Department of Justice. Way back in 1908 and again in 1928, the Congress authorized the purchase of some land. At the time, it was not entirely vacant, but right there on Pennsylvania Avenue, known as Federal Triangle. Those of you who've been in Washington, D.C. know that well. That's where the Department of Justice presently is located. As Amicus, a law review continues, I'll tell you more about the building of that Department of Justice and the important, significant symbols of your place of justice in Washington, D.C. All that coming up here on Amicus, a law review. This is Amicus, a law review, our weekly weekend review of all things justice-related, rule of law-related, including especially this broadcast as we take our assessment of what the President of the United States of America did and said just on Friday of this week. a virtually unprecedented nature of his address to members of the Department of Justice gathered in the Great Hall, this major, majestic hall. I will describe that in just a moment, to give us some sense about what his animus is toward people out there, the retribution that he is going to visit upon Americans. It is stunning. It is shocking. It is completely incongruous with the very purposes and visions and missions of the Department of Justice, not only in terms of the creation of this department, but the building itself in every single aspect speaks about things that are so much more lofty, so much more important, so much beyond what my president said yesterday in the Department of Justice, that the news story itself about his presence there, his visit, the importance of it cannot be overstated. Again, in 1930, after Congress previously had purchased this plot of land right there on Pennsylvania Avenue, Congress appropriated a whopping, in today's dollars, $10 million. $10 million for the construction, finally, of a permanent Department of Justice headquarters right there in the Federal Triangle. Again, you walk by it every time you're walking down the main thoroughfare there between the Capitol building and the White House, Pennsylvania Avenue. The Department of Justice is there. It's been there since 1935. 1% of the cost of the construction was for art. And that's important because there was a conscious decision made at the time of the architectural design, the construction, the development of the building to ensure that the messages of justice oozed from every single piece of structure in the building. Between 1935 and 1941, 68 different murals were painted in the building. It was an example of New Deal art, which you probably know much about. So what else do we know about the Department of Justice? Again, in addition to the fact that it's now called the RFK building, and George W. Bush, the one who did that on November 20th of 2001 in recognition of the service of Robert F. Kennedy as our Attorney General way back in the early 1960s. The design of the building took its influences from a neoclassical, sort of a Greek revival practice and policy, and Art Deco architectural also. The design was similar to many other buildings you also see there along Pennsylvania Avenue and Federal Triangle. It has an Indiana limestone facade from right here in the Midwest. It covers a steel frame. It's got some red tile roof and some colonnades throughout the building as well. It's got these wonderful interior courtyards. They were intended to provide light and ventilation and convey the sense of an open and transparent aspect of justice, even inside the building itself. Significantly, one of two inscriptions I'm going to tell you about. You can see many of them. They're blazoned all over the outside of the building. One of them, one of my two favorites, is this. The inscription on one of the sides of the RFK Department of Justice building, again designed and then constructed, finally opened in 1935, is this. It says, "Justice is founded in the rights bestowed by nature upon man. Liberty is maintained in security of justice." In other words, justice supports our liberty. Justice is founded upon rights that are known to all of us. Message on the exterior of the Department of Justice, completely contrary to what the President of the United States of America said in that hallowed place, in this important place where justice is administered every single day. Now, significantly as well, one of the things you will note that makes it unlike some of the other buildings in the Federal Triangle is just this. Many of them were cast in bronze. There are various aspects of sculptures and other doors and things. Supreme Court, for example, has these big bronze doors there up on Capitol Hill, the Commerce Building, all kinds of things there. Even the Chase Manhattan Bank, not too far from that. Lots of things having to do with kind of traditional metals used. The decision was made at the time of the Department of Justice construction to use aluminum. And indeed you can see that metal blazoned on the exterior and also the interior of the building, quite literally up and down the staircases of it, and many interior distinctive spaces, including the Great Hall itself. The Great Hall itself that has these Art Deco light features, terracotta tile floors, gray marble borders, and also the Law Library, which is upstairs. It's located on the 5th floor. It's a 2-story room. It's also distinguished by some wonderful Art Deco panels, and again, emblazoned with signs and signals about what justice is supposed to mean for all Americans. The interior of the U.S. Department of Justice contains many decorative wall paintings. They were purposely designed, these murals, to depict what scenes of daily life. And what was the point of that? It was to ensure that there is a connection between the daily life of people in America and what goes on in that building, the administering and the promotion of justice. Throughout American history, an awful lot of reminiscences about where we have been, symbolic interpretations or allegories relating to what? To the role of justice in our system and the role that lawyers play, and lawyers who are committed not to a particular president, but committed to serving the American public. In all, there are 68 different murals completed between 1935 and 1941, cost a whopping $68,000, again, 1% of the cost of the building. Those artists included George Biddle, Henry Varnum Poor, John Stewart Curry, Boardman Robinson, Emil Bistrom, and Leon Crow. You may recognize some of those artists. It is fantastic art, commissioned, again, to send the message to anybody who's inside the department and those who are outside of it. Along the Pennsylvania Avenue, 9th and 10th Street, Constitution on the other side, all of them to know that this is a special place. Those striking mosaics on the ceilings, on the walls, all of them convey this important notion about the Department of Justice. And then we have the Great Hall. And that is the place where the President of the United States of America on Friday delivered this horrific speech that basically did not acknowledge anything about what the building itself is about, what justice is all about, but another rant. Another campaign-type rant against all the people who, in his perspective, have done him wrong. The spirit of justice, this lofty, amazing, cast aluminum Art Deco statue is designed by an architect named Genuine. It depicts Lady Justice. It's a woman wearing a toga-like dress. It stands on huge display along with a male counterpart called the Majesty of Law in the Great Hall. You probably have seen some pictures of it. You can go online and see these majestic statues again, and designed to promote the visual importance of what goes on there. Unlike many representations of Lady Justice, the spirit of justice standing there in the Great Hall has no blindfold on to symbol blind justice. And that was also intentional. The notion that, yes, indeed, there should be lawyers and there should be practitioners, civil litigants, and criminal prosecutors who are visually attuned to the facts around them, the life circumstances around them. The statutes, both of them, the majesty of law and the spirit of justice, they measure 12.5 feet. And they're commissioned in 1933 at a cost of $7,000. They stand there in the Great Hall since 1936. All of that a part of what's happening inside the Department of Justice. We know as well that was there in the Great Hall that Donald Trump yesterday spent a huge amount of time talking about what he viewed the Department of Justice is all about. We'll get to that right after this as the broadcast here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media as Amicus, a law review continues. Stay with us. Amicus, a law review. My name's Jim Santelle, your host for this hour and also next hour on the broadcast stations of Civic Media, joined in the Civic Media studios by my producer, Max, and together we're taking your phone calls and your comments, both in the Dropbox and also call in. Be a part of the discussion at 855-752-4842. Necessarily talking on Amicus, a law review this weekend about one of the most stunning events in American history, the visit by a sitting president to the Department of Justice, completely contrary to what all his predecessors have done, and upsetting, frankly, well, decades and decades of understandings about the relationship, the arm's length relationship between the Department of Justice and the presidency. Even for Donald Trump, even his standards, this was a stunning show, a stunning, shocking show of disregard for decades, those decades of tradition by his predecessors, who often worried, Republicans and Democrats alike, others who preceded Republicans and Democrats, they worried about politicizing, appearing to be exerting way too much authority, too much control over the nation's most powerful law enforcement agency. Not this president. Trump instead called himself the chief law enforcement officer in our country. Technically not true, not true. That's the Attorney General. He has certainly supervisory responsibilities here, and then accused the Department of Justice's prior leadership, presumably that of Joe Biden and those before him, of doing, quote, everything within their power to prevent him from becoming the president. Stunning, stunning in many, many ways. For a man who long ago has dispensed of this notion, certainly was true in his first term. He has completely abandoned it now in his second term, the notion of an independent Department of Justice that, yes, can take general acceptances of views and perspectives and missions and purposes from a president, but does not get involved. A president does not get involved in designing particular criminal prosecutions and particular civil cases. For a president who long dispensed with all of that, it is gone in America. That norm, that standard of behavior that has animated virtually all previous administrations, that's gone. Even for this president, it was an expression this past week of conquest. We have now conquered through the works that we have done, through the election of November of last year, a vindication of all that he has said. And that was the spirit, that was the mission, that was the purpose of what he was all about. He said, is it appropriate that I do this? Did I come here to the Department of Justice and make this speech? He was asking the department officials who were there. And then he said, and then I realized it's not only appropriate, I think it's really important that he do just that. So what, in fact, did he say? Well, it was broad-based. It was about an hour-long rambling, incoherent in many ways, as is often the expression of Donald Trump. Along the way, some language that is not common to anyone who has addressed a group inside that august hall called Great Hall inside Main Justice. He attacked the media, CNN, MSNBC, newspapers generally. They're the enemy, once again, of the people, as he said previously on Friday, describing them as corrupt and illegal, somehow illegal, contrary, of course, to what the First Amendment of the Constitution says, all about the legitimacy of our media and the importance of an independent press. He attacked individuals. He attacked a group called the Contrarian News Service, a cruise news service that provides, yes, indeed, perspectives that Donald Trump does not like, attacked many other people, and basically called upon the Department of Justice to go after them. He described them repeatedly as being illegal, being corrupt, being contrary to the basic tenets of our nation when it comes to news and sharing information, completely contrary to what was envisioned by our founding fathers, not just in the Constitution, but as they explained it in the Federalist Papers, as the Supreme Court, as every other federal court and state court in America has reaffirmed the legitimacy of independent news agencies. Yes, indeed, to be critical, to be a part of the process that prompts, again, in the marketplace of ideas, as the Supreme Court once described it. Attacking our president was all of those institutions, electronic media, print media, people online, people with broadcasts of great fame, those who are not in the general attention of America. Many of them, if not all of them, who would take a different view than that of our president, now in his eyesight condemning them and indicating that's his opinion that they're illegal and that they plainly should go away. Along the way, he makes reference to his Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, who is also right there. He calls him Todd, and sort of a wink to him says, yes, we need to get about going after this part of American society, a free press that has been stopping apparently the American public from understanding accurately what's going on. In fact, Mr. President, just the opposite. Scum. He called his adversaries scum. In the same room where Attorney General Robert Jackson in 1940 delivered just the opposite kind of a speech. I'm going to get to that in just a few moments or so. He called his adversaries scum. He delivered this speech, free association, once again, word salad. Message, however, was unmistakable. The president unmistakably intends to bend these vast powers of federal law enforcement, now vested in his attorney general, Pam Bondi, his deputy attorney, his former counsel in criminal cases named Todd Blanche, in the pursuit of, yes, an anti-crime agenda, but perhaps also more importantly, a vengeance agenda. He said this. He said, in recent years, unfortunately, a corrupt group of hacks and radicals within the ranks of the American government obliterated the trust and the goodwill built up over generations. Well, that trust and goodwill was in fact built up, Mr. President, but you're destroying it. And went on to say they weaponized the vast powers of our intelligence and law enforcement agencies to try and thwart the will of the American people. He implored, he urged, he commanded his political appointees right there in the room and beyond not to be, as he said, deflected by critics in enforcing his agenda. Again, the politicization of the Department of Justice there, unmistakable. He suggested that he was preparing a new executive order, a series of actions to personally target what he called the violent, vicious lawyers who prosecuted him or opposed his policies in court. We're going to talk later on in the broadcast about his attack upon lawyers, private attorneys, who, again, a part of our system of justice in America. He said, we're turning the page on 4 long years of corruption, weaponization, and surrender to violent criminals. He talked about how violence in America was at all-time highs, simply wrong. And if you were to stop and visit across the street at the FBI, the main FBI headquarters there, the J. Edgar Hoover building, it's that very modern-like looking building, very much unlike the Department of Justice building built in 1935. He'd stop by the FBI. They would tell him that indeed in virtually all areas, crime has been down, trending down in America, not what he said yesterday. And he said, we're restoring fair, equal, and impartial justice. That's what the president said yesterday from the Great Hall, as standing by a lectern that was flanked by signs reading, fighting fentanyl. Didn't comment at all about that particular focus of the Department of Justice. He also heaped praise along at least one of his appointees to the federal bench. He said he doesn't know her, never met her. Her name is Eileen Cannon. You recall is the judge who dismissed that case, that Mar-a-Lago documents case against him over the handling of those classified and other national security documents, calling her the absolute model of what a judge should be. And that's also a part of his practice, as we know. If you run afoul of him, you get criticized. And indeed, you're in the target of retribution, as he announced yesterday, explicitly, unconditionally, and you are on his side, you get praise. He said the case against me was, and I'm not going to repeat the word that he used, but he said it was something standing in the building where the charges against him were actually approved by the Department of Justice. And we know, of course, that presidents have their opportunities throughout their terms to express views on things that happen in America, including Supreme Court cases. This went far beyond that. The president also, of course, followed this presentation by 2 others who he had also appointed recently. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, was there. He offered sort of a cheerful, cherry-picked recitation of the department's accomplishments thus far, the acceleration of immigration enforcement, efforts to punish academic institutions that somehow choose not to bow to the administration's demand to purge, yes, that's right, diversity and inclusion programs, intensifying efforts to fight fentanyl trafficking. And that's good. That's good that the Deputy Attorney General responsible for the day-to-day operation would talk about at least that last focus on addressing the problem of drugs in America. Todd Blanche again began by expressing his commitment to upholding the best traditions of the department. He knows them because he was there before. He was a former prosecutor, but he quickly shifted gears to profess once again what Donald Trump insists of all of his appointees, including this one, with whom he used to have just a couple of weeks ago, several months ago, an attorney-client relationship. He professed, that is, Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, his undying personal loyalty to the president, something that none of his predecessors in any administration have ever done. Mr. Trump, Todd Blanche said, the number 2 at the Department of Justice is a complete inspiration to me. That's what the Deputy Attorney General said. Pam Bondi was also there, again, along with the FBI Director, Kash Patel, likewise heaping praise upon this president, echoed Mr. Blanche, and she called Donald Trump the greatest president in the history of our country. And here's whether you agree with that or not, it got even more troubling. She went on to say this. She said she works, implicitly, she said all of the Department of Justice works at the directive of Donald Trump. Those were her words, not mine. The directive of Donald Trump. Again, another nod to the Trump presidency being in control of the Justice Department. Shocking in terms of the ways in which these messages were conveyed, the substance of them, not a policy speech, not at all the kind of thing that we would anticipate from a president who is there, number one, to outline his plans in the next 4 years for a Department of Justice that fires on all these important Justice Department cylinders, including antitrust and the environment and education and labor and national security and civil rights and human rights and everything else that the Department of Justice is responsible for in terms of promoting the interests of justice. Didn't do that at all yesterday. Didn't talk about specific designs and plans that he had for the future of America. Talked about getting back at the people who have wronged him in his views, talked about retribution, and invited the Department of Justice to do that on his behalf, received from the leadership of the Department of Justice a commitment to do that. This speech and the response it got should be the source of tremendous concern and even more outrage in the midst of all the outrage of the past couple of months, even more outrage because of the nature of it and the ways in which the messages were conveyed. Witness what happened in 1940. Robert Jackson, 5 years into the occupying of this wonderful, amazing building there on Pennsylvania Avenue. Robert Jackson would go on to be on the Supreme Court, but at the time he was the Attorney General of the United States of America. Witness what Robert Jackson said again in that great hall, that very place where Donald Trump was standing on Friday. Robert Jackson, then the Attorney General, the chief federal law enforcement officer, said this. He said, the qualities of a good prosecutor are as elusive and as impossible to define as those which mark a gentleman. He went on to say, and those who need to be told would not understand it anyway. Attorney General Robert Jackson went on to say, a sensitivity to fair play and sportsmanship is perhaps the best protection against the abuse of power, and the citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor who tempers zeal with human kindness, who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches his task with humility. I hope that should inspire all of us these decades later. That was 1940, Robert Jackson, the Attorney General. Contrast that with what our president said in that same place, in that same hallowed hall at Main Justice just on Friday of this past week, and know that it will animate going forward what this Justice Department does through the FBI, the other agencies, the investigative agencies, under the supervision of the Attorney General, an Attorney General who, again, on Friday, pledged her complete allegiance, not to you, not to the people of America, not to our nation, its future, its present, but rather to the White House and to the Attorney General. When we return, a final comment about this, again, hearkening back to what's on the outside of the Department of Justice, and then also taking calls and reciting some of the texts we're getting about this very important issue in American history, this event that happened in America just this past week here on Amicus, a law review. law review necessarily out of complete obligation to our purpose, which is to be a friend of the community, getting some sense about what's going on in the world of justice in America and beyond, necessarily talking about this terrible address given by the President of the United States of America at the Department of Justice, not defining any of his visions or his missions for the Department of Justice, but in many ways reminiscent of what he did on the campaign trail, an attack upon various people, including the media, prompting Mark to send in a note saying Trump is likely even more thin-skinned than John Adams was, who also hated a free press. The press at the time was equally, if not more, partisan. Federalists and Democratic Republican papers taking positions on issues. Mark, appreciate that comment as well. And noting, as I said at the outset, that as you walk by the Department of Justice, strongly encouraging you the next time you're in Washington, D.C., as you're walking up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, take a moment. It doesn't take long to circle 9th and 10th and Pennsylvania and Constitution. Look up. Look up at the Department of Justice building itself and see all of these amazingly important statements about law and justice in America purposely emblazoned on the side of the building. This is my favorite. It's at the very corner of 9th and Pennsylvania, just across from the FBI building, and a little bit paraphrased because the language is a little bit arcane. It says this, and it goes to the question of what do we do about all this? What do we do about all of the concerns that we've had, not just this speech, but all the other things going on? The Department of Justice there right on Pennsylvania Avenue, the building itself tells us this. It says, before justice can exist in the conduct and the conscience of a government, before justice can exist in the conduct and the conscience of a government, it must first reside in the hearts and souls of its citizens. Before justice can exist in the conduct and conscience of a government, it must first reside in the hearts and the souls of its citizens. Before we can expect that a Department of Justice, a government, a White House, any trappings of our government are conducting themselves in a way that's proper, consistent with the Constitution, that they have, yes, a conscience, a governmental conscience. Those things have to first reside in our hearts and souls. And that I would offer to you all on this broadcast of Amicus as a call to work toward those ends. It is up to us. Our hearts and souls need to animate what we do next. We're the ones who can push back on these horrific messages being given by our president, by our attorney general, and by so many other cabinet officers, officials now of the government, invested with authority, but apparently not the conduct and the conscience that really is ours. And our hearts and souls need to adopt what it says there. Before justice can exist in the conduct and conscience of a government, of our government at any time, it has to reside first in our hearts and souls, and we need to act on that. Appreciate, as I said, greatly comments on the Dropbox, also callers calling in our broadcast, and that includes you, Joe from Madison. Joe, thanks for joining us again in our discussion today.
Thanks, Jim. I don't think we can talk about this enough because it's really unparalleled. This guy just blowing his top and trashing our First Amendment, not his, our First Amendment. So I wanted to just bring up briefly, yesterday I had talked with you about on another show, the Devil's Advocate show, the Dom show. And my question was this question of, there's a nonprofit group called Crew that he went after,
right,
and he described the person who ran that as, quote, violent.
Yes,
and then he used language of being illegal against CNN. These things we determined, are defamatory. He is trashing them, and that creates not only a reputational harm, and that reputational harm can be expressed in loss of business, all sorts of things. So my question for you is, though, I was thinking about it later. If you were to bring defamation charges against the president, really an unprecedented thing to do, in this president, with this Supreme Court saying he's not liable for anything, he's the president, he can get away with what he wants to. What redress do these people have to say, you have trashed our reputation, you have defamed us, now what? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that matter, and maybe you can't get to them now, next hour, whenever. Thanks very much, Jim.
Joe, thanks so much for the comment. And yes, indeed, Joe, your points are not only well taken, but they do invoke recent history. You know, there has been some success, right? I think in the broadcast yesterday when I was appearing with Dom Salvia on his afternoon show, we talked about E. Jean Carroll, who was defamed by this president during the course of his first term when he's called her a liar about what happened to her, the sexual assault of her many years ago in the 1990s when he attacked her in that store in Manhattan. Defamed her, and yes, indeed, juries. This isn't a court. This wasn't Joe Biden. This was a court and a jury in particular brought together, and they found defamation there, imposed judgments, multiple jury verdicts against him, again, alleging defamation. It is possible to do it. Again, we know that in the wake of that, as you just indicated, Joe, the Supreme Court basically saying that presidents can't be entangled with things like that, but the law of defamation presumably still applies to a president. Again, in the interest of a little bit of civics here, a little bit of law school, which we sometimes do. Amicus, friend of the community, doing some teaching, some instruction here. Defamation. Plaintiff generally needs to prove a false statement of fact. And again, Joe, this reference to the president to these various entities, one in particular, one individual in particular being violent. He's presumably talking about physical violence, simply completely wrong, unsupported. A false statement of fact being made, published to some third parties, absolutely. Published not just to the Department of Justice, but to 334 million people in America, and also causing harm to reputation. Joe, as you just indicated, that's the kind of thing that can indeed harm reputation. The Dominion lawsuit, the Dominion voting machines lawsuit against Fox News, this is kind of a reverse media case. They also got a huge judgment against Fox News. Why? Because Fox News was saying things were simply wrong about the operation and the conduct of those machines. When a president gets up and says things that are overtly false statements, knows what he's doing, does so either out of malice or negligence, and has that impact, the statement is false and affects the reputation, those are the elements of a defamation lawsuit. And I would like to believe that the America, and Joe, I think you do, and virtually all of our listeners do, like to think that the America that we know and that we regard still with great honor does still have a defamation law that could apply to the presidency of the United States of America. Important notion to keep in mind. Important notion also to note that it's the New York Times versus Sullivan in the other direction. In the other direction, the president complaining, as Joe just indicated once again, about media. The only basis upon which to go after the media is if they show express malice, hatred, knowing that the things that they're publishing are wrong and doing it out of malice. That's the New York Times versus Sullivan standard. When we come back here in Amicus, we're going to do a little bit more talking about what happened this past week. Again, taking your phone calls, taking your comments, which we appreciate tremendously here on our discussion forum, which is Amicus, a law review.
Welcome to Amicus, a law review with Jim Santelle, Civic Media's weekly review and discussion of some of the most significant news stories in the areas of law, government, courts, and the aspiration for justice. And now, here's your host, Jim Santelle.
This is the second hour of our weekend broadcast, Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle, necessarily out of absolute obligation and absolute commitment to truth and to accuracy and to highlighting those things that should be at the forefront of all of our considerations as we think about government in 2025 and beyond. Think about government, where it has been, where it is going in the future. Need necessarily to spend some time pondering the horror of what happened yesterday, Friday, at the Department of Justice in connection with the speech delivered by our president to Department of Justice employees there in the Great Hall, but frankly, to all Americans. While this is not unprecedented, it's fairly rare for a president to visit the Department of Justice, but it's not unprecedented. That's not the problem here. But what is the problem is that Donald Trump repeatedly breached other norms of all kinds and also called upon a horrific amount of conduct in retribution, as he has said during the course of his campaign. He slammed former officials, as we know. He unleashed attacks on private attorneys, about which we'll talk more in just moments. He touted once again, as he always does, his vote tallies in last year's election. He talked about those people who would oppose him. He said, these are people that are bad people, really bad people, and went on to condemn once again various officials, including those who directed the military's withdrawal from Afghanistan, repeated his false claim about the 2020 election being stolen, and then said the people who did this to us should go to jail. It was, again, even by Donald Trump's standards, a stunning show of disregard, inaccuracy, as Joe indicated in our first hour, defamation of people from the pulpit there in Main Justice, in remarks that were variously dark and sometimes exultant, sometimes incomprehensible, pugnacious, all across the board. Donald Trump, my president, vowed to remake the United States Department of Justice and to retaliate against his enemies, some of whom he called thugs. We appreciate so much the comments and questions of all of you. Thank you for calling in. Thank you for contributing to our discussion here on Amicus. And that includes Richard calling in from Waukesha. Richard, thank you for being a part of our discussion on our broadcast.
Thanks for the information here. I've got something to say about you. I studied a real lot Richard Nixon because I was just getting through high school at the time.
Sure.
And I came across something. I do a lot of history reading and came across something. I have a DVD I came across. It's called are you heard of John Lennon from the Beatles, the musical group?
I think I have. I suspect most of our listeners have done so as well, right? A terrific, terrific musician, obviously horrific assassination. And we miss him to this day. John Lennon, you've got a DVD, yes?
Yeah, and he had trouble in New York, and I have a DVD. It's titled John Lennon versus the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
And he had trouble getting deported all the time by Richard Nixon,
right,
or attempted to be deported out of New York.
Right.
And the gist of the video is interviews with his lawyers and his life and interviews with him. And during the Richard Nixon era, during the impeachment attempts or whatever happened, information came out, and there's an interview with his attorney that it disclosed that he was targeted by the President of the United States, sure, and influencing the deportation people in New York.
Right.
And they won their case.
Right. an abuse of power then by Richard Nixon. One of many, many things that Richard Nixon did during the course of his presidency, abusing his authority given to him, right, by the American people in the election, abusing authority under the Constitution. You can't be out there targeting, waking up in the morning and saying, I don't like what that person's doing or saying. Let's go after them. That's exactly the kind of thing that cannot happen in America, because it results, as you're indicating, Richard, in injustice being done. Without being able to go into the specifics of the John Lennon case, that's the reason why we don't have presidents saying we want the Department of Justice. We don't want any unit of government specifically targeting someone because we don't like them. This past week, on Friday, the President of the United States of America invited more of just that, provided some names in particular, including names of attorneys, names of people who are out there advocating under the First Amendment their own views and effectively calling upon the American population, certainly calling upon the Department of Justice to go after them. Richard, appreciate the historical reference there. It has happened before. It seems to be happening again. As significant as we push back on this, again, knowing that the hearts and the missions and the souls of America should be with us as we push back on the conduct and the apparent lack of conscience of this government. Also appreciate calling in Larry. Larry, this morning and this day, appreciate your comments here on our broadcast.
Hi, this is Jean from Eau Claire.
Jean, all right, very good. Jean, glad to have you with us.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for providing information on the way things could be and have been in the past, so that people don't think that this is going to be the new norm.
Right.
That we do have voices, and that this kind of behavior hasn't happened in our history, not like this.
Right.
And the implication that it has for all of us. So thank you so much, and keep up the great work of the history. And also, please give us ideas of what we can do as citizens of the United States, because I've never seen, I'm 70 and I've watched my government for many years, and I have never in my lifetime seen what's happening here in the takeover of our country. And now the DOJ right in front of us saying retribution. So thank you so much, James. Keep up the great work. Thank you. Bye.
Jean, thanks so much for the call. Appreciate those very, very kind words. And Jean, as you know, and other listeners, that's our mission. That's what Amicus is all about, taking our name from the Latin, the legal purpose, which is friend, meaning a friend who speaks honestly about what is true, what is not true. And Jean, appreciate that support from you. Yes, we are going to spend some time talking in future broadcasts about specific things that can be done. I'm compiling a list of things, great and small, but always, Jean, in response to that question, which we asked long before the current Trump presidency, which is what can you do? What are you prepared to do to preserve your democracy? And there can be answers along the spectrum of everything from nothing. There are those families and those people who, because of their circumstances, are simply not able to do anything in response or in pushback, and that is okay. That's part of our system as well, that we can all respond as we can do so in our own circumstances. To far extremes of, again, filing the lawsuits and doing the public protests, engaging in nonviolent behaviors, other things that also convey great myriads of things in between that spectrum of things you can do in response to the outrages that we are seeing today, not only at the Department of Justice, but across the board. So, Jean, appreciate that very much. One of the things, of course, taking a page from what the president just said on Friday, his attack upon lawyers. Let me say at the outset that I appreciate good lawyer jokes just like anybody else does. There are some very funny things out there, of course, where they're not serious. We're not advocating violence against any lawyers, attorneys, judges, court staff, anybody who's a part of the judicial process. But humor is a good thing. Humor is a good thing, and this is not about that. When Donald Trump specifically identifies particular lawyers and issues executive orders, as he has done now in recent days with respect to specific law firms, he is targeting them. This is a part of the retribution that Donald Trump has talked about, again, at the Department of Justice, but also in other settings. So what do we know about this? Well, we know that Donald Trump has issued at least 2 executive orders, one of them having to do with the law firm of Perkins Coie. Another one having to do with the law firm Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. There's actually a third law firm, Covington and Burling, all big law firms. All what are sometimes called big law. They hold an important posture in our American system of jurisprudence. I worked very briefly during the summers of my law school for a big law firm in Chicago, another big law firm right there in New York City and in Rockefeller Plaza. And they do hold an important posture because they represent people. And it's also implicit, if not explicit, in our Constitution that the notion of legal representation is important. We go into the courts with lawyers. We do other things through the auspices and the training and the instruction of lawyers to advance the rights that we think we need to advance. That's a part of our American system. And yes, indeed, lawyers don't always get it right. We know from recent history that sometimes lawyers go incredibly awry. We've seen lawyers, again, representing the interests of Donald Trump in his first term, not only finding themselves on the receiving end of bar complaints, being dismissed from the bar, being expelled from the bar, suspended from various bars for misrepresentations they made, having received judgments against them, millions of dollars for the things that they have said, the defamations that they've engaged in, all of that. All of that. Lawyers are not perfect like any other profession, and sometimes, appropriately, the system says, no, you can't do that. But lawyers also, including, I would hasten to add, criminal defense attorneys, incredibly important, just as important as criminal prosecutors. I was a prosecutor for 30 years, also did a huge amount of civil litigation, recognizing fully that the system does not work without criminal defense attorneys on the other side of the courtroom, also relying, of course, upon juries and upon witnesses and judges and court staff and all the other people who make all of this work, lawyers at the core of all of that. Knowing that that's the case, knowing that the lawyers are the bastions, the people who in many ways defend the trappings of justice, the institutions that keep us all on the straight and narrow, Donald Trump issues executive orders against these firms, including Perkins Coie. He prohibits them from entering federal buildings, including courthouses, which basically prevents them from doing their jobs, discouraging federal officials from interacting with them, engaging in communications that make it all but impossible for the firms to advocate for their clients. Again, we know at least about 3 of these firms, Perkins Coie, and the other firms as well, that the president has targeted. Paul Weiss and Covington and Burling, all of them targeted. Why? Because they've represented clients with whom the current president, has had objection. When we come back, we'll talk about what some of those lawyers are doing to push back against what Donald Trump is doing, advocating for the systems of justice and their roles in this justice system as Amicus, a law review, continues. This is Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle, along with Max, my terrific producer here at Radio Park in Racine, taking your calls and also your comments. You can drop those in the studio chat and be a part of our discussion. Coming in the wake of this president's horrific presentation to Department of Justice employees just this past week in this hallowed hall at Main Justice, the Great Hall, with statues of liberty and justice on either side of him, also attacking lawyers along the way. We'll talk about the reasons why he does that. And that basically goes to the fact that they are the folks who are pushing back against him. Gene asking before, what can we do? Not only in connection with this particular speech, but arguably even more important, what can we do when we see all of these injustices being visited upon federal employees, upon the very rights that you have to access to government, all the other things the president's been doing lately? You can, in fact, support these various lawsuits, the lawyers who are out there advocating, maybe not on behalf of you as particular plaintiffs, but yes, advocating on behalf of the policies and the broad principles that you hold dear. In fact, the president, again, issuing these attacks upon law firms, not only Perkins Coie, but also Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. White House officials saying the president signing an executive order to suspend the security clearances held by people at the firm, pending review of whether those clearances are consistent with the national interest, basically preventing those lawyers, therefore, becoming involved in cases involving national security concerns, frankly, of the sort that was pending before Judge Eileen Cannon in South Florida. The order also seeks to sharply limit the employees of that firm, again, from coming into federal buildings, stopping them from doing their work, getting government jobs, receiving any money from federal contracts. All of that coming out of the presidency in recent times. So what happens? What happens? Well, there's at least one lawsuit. More of them are coming to push back on this. One of them lands in the courtroom of United States District Judge Beryl Howell. We have heard from her before. We know about her. She is a federal district court judge. She's a trial judge. She is in Washington, D.C., and so that's why many of these cases end up in front of her and in front of her colleagues. She, you may recall, has not only presided over some very significant cases, including a case recently where Judge Howell said that the president did not have the authority to fire members of the National Labor Relations Board, and she attacked his view as being a monarch. She said, a president who touts an image of himself as a king or a dictator, perhaps as his vision of effective leadership, fundamentally misapprehends his role. That's what Judge Beryl Howell has said just in recent days. She has been saying more now, and because one of these lawsuits randomly assigned to her, the one involving Perkins Coie, the executive order issued against it and its employees, lands in front of her. And what she does just this past week is she decisively, from the bench, enters an order saying, no, Mr. President, you can't do this either. I'm pushing back on this. I'm telling you not to enforce that particular executive order. Can't do it. It's inconsistent with the Constitution. Once again, you're not a monarch. And the process contemplates, once again, the role of attorneys. You can't pick and choose who can serve as lawyers involved in the work of government. She said this, regardless of whether the president dislikes the firm's clients, and yes, indeed, Perkins Coie formerly represented a fantastic American leader. Her name is Hillary Clinton. She used to be the Secretary of State. She used to be a senator from the state of New York. She used to be the First Lady of the United States of America, an advocate for civil rights, for all good things in America. They represented her in the past. Plainly, Donald Trump is not a fan of Hillary Clinton, so he attacks this firm for that and other reasons, candidly. And so Beryl Howell, the judge, says the president dislikes the firm's clients. Regardless of that, issuing an executive order targeting the law firm based on the president's dislike of the political positions of the firm's clients or the firm's litigation positions is retaliatory. He's retaliating against. This is, again, another word for what? Retribution, right? And it runs head on, she says, into the wall of First Amendment protection. Headlong into the wall of First Amendment protections. The attorneys have a First Amendment right to advocate on behalf of their clients in the courts and beyond. They've also got a right to engage in the commercial practice of law. She goes on to say in her ruling, blocking parts of the executive order that she found unlawful, the president is certainly entitled to his own belief, entitled to his preferred causes, and yes, indeed, he's entitled to hold tight to his own dislikes, she said. The Constitution protects all of us, however. The judge goes on to say, from the exercise of his targeted power based on those dislikes, triggering the force of the federal government down on the lawyers representing his political opponents and challengers to his political actions, as he has done here. Judge Howell telling him, knock it off, Mr. President. Can't do this. Entering a temporary restraining order. She's going to have more hearings down the road, presumably in support of a preliminary injunction to void this executive order, and presumably others. More of these lawsuits coming up with respect to other executive orders against other lawyers. Along the way, this Judge Beryl Howell, exceptionally bright, exceptionally literate, exceptionally understanding the principles of our Constitution, also did this. She said, you know, a fellow named Lewis Carroll wrote something called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. She compared my current president to a character, a fictitious character, of course, called the Queen of Hearts, who at the slightest inconvenience, the slightest disruption to anything the Queen of Hearts did not like, what did she say? You may recall this from your days of reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Maybe you're reading it right now. Maybe pick it up again and make reference to find those passages in which the Queen of Hearts responds badly to inconveniences in her life and things she does not like. How does she do that? She says, off with their heads. Off with their heads, the Queen of Hearts says. The Judge, Beryl Howell, invokes Lewis Carroll in doing just that, in saying you can't act like the Queen of Hearts. You are not a monarch. You're not a queen. You're not a king. You're not a regent. You're not a part of the monarchy. Can't do this, Mr. President. And so she stops him from doing it. The fact that the guardrails of our American system, we think there are something approaching 150 lawsuits now across the country, virtually all of them being presided over by both Republican-appointed and democratically appointed judges, almost all of them finding, there are a few exceptions out there, things where the judges, again, weigh and sift and determine that every so often the president and his people do get it right and are able to exercise some authorities. But the great majority of the judges saying you can't do these things. We'll talk about another one that's headed to the Supreme Court later in this particular hour. But judges are the guardrails. They're the ones who, once again, are holding back. The other one that's out there, we don't know a lot about that, but our federal grand juries that are perhaps being presented with evidence of non-crime, things that are not happening. We'll talk in a future broadcast about what happened inside the U.S. Attorney's Office recently with respect to the U.S. Attorney there and efforts to try to pursue in front of grand juries their actions, criminal actions, for which there's no evidence. Grand juries can also be guardrails against a president and a Department of Justice like this that would seek to undermine our basic processes. Along the way, Judge Beryl Howell just this past week saying, no, can't act like the Queen of Hearts. I would add to that, Judge, with great respect, another literary reference, and that is from Shakespeare. There are at least a couple of them that talk about the importance of judges and lawyers and the governmental trappings that are sometimes the subject of focuses. When we come back, I'll tell you more about that additional reference, that literary reference from Shakespeare, that also gives us some sense about how these cases against lawyers should be handled and are being handled by our federal judiciary. Here on Amicus, a law review. Santelle, your host for these remaining segments here on our weekend broadcast, talking about, once again, necessarily our president, the things he has done and said that undermine the basic trappings of justice in America. We are simply 2 months into this term, as you know well. Lots of predictive forces coming out of this speech at Maine Justice just late this past week. Not good ones, focusing not upon policy, not upon practices, not even on adjustments and things you'd like to do in terms of the focuses of what the Department of Justice does in many, many different diverse areas of our lives and our livelihoods, but rather talking about weaponizing the Department of Justice, even as he maintains that his own conduct is in response to the weaponization against him. Lots of things going on there, including from the president, attacks upon lawyers, specific law firms who represented clients, taken positions against him, including a law firm that has formerly represented his political opponent for the presidency, her name Hillary Clinton, and others on the Democratic side of the aisle. Just this past week, Beryl Howell, a federal district court judge in Washington, D.C., saying, no, you can't do that, Mr. President. It runs headlong into the First Amendment, stopping him from preventing access by these attorneys at the law firm. And presumably as other judges take up the other executive orders, they will enter the same kinds of orders. She made reference, of course, to the president being like the Queen of Hearts, who at the slightest inconvenience saying off with their heads. I would offer this additional perspective from Shakespeare this time, Henry VI, Part 2. There's a character, of course, fictitious, created by William Shakespeare, but conveying an awful lot when it comes to justice. Shakespeare's works are full of justice-related, not just statements and comments and perspectives and theories, but also characters who in their actions and their words convey an awful lot from way back in the 17th century, things that are applicable here in the 21st century as well. It's a character in that play named Dick the Butcher. Yes, you heard that right. Dick the Butcher, he's a part of a gang, you can only say. They want to overthrow the throne. They want to impose their own views of justice, if there are any, on the throne. They want to take over. They want to establish a coup over the monarchy here and put themselves in power. Dick the Butcher looks at his henchmen and says, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Let's kill all the lawyers. That's where that phrase comes from. An awful lot of people think that that's the first lawyer joke. It actually is not, because as you peel it back, and again, people have written lots of things about Shakespeare, of course, generally, and huge numbers of things about Henry VI, Part 2, and the justice themes there. But the reality is that in the context of the play, being spoken by Dick the Butcher, what that means is that lawyers are the ones who hold back against those forces that would overthrow governments, that would undermine justice, that are there to represent the people. Lawyers and attorneys are the ones that keep us on the straight and narrow. And if we get rid of them, if we issue executive orders, if we stop them from entering federal buildings, if we revoke their security clearances and keep them from doing their jobs, the autocracy, the authoritarianism that we hope to accomplish, the coup that Dick the Butcher and others would hope to realize, that's further advanced. Dick the Butcher is saying the first thing you do, let's kill all the lawyers as a way of establishing anarchy. I would offer that our president, in attacking the lawyers once again in America, we can disagree with the lawyers, we can disagree with their clients, we can take shots, and we can disagree with the things that they advocate for in court, but that's the First Amendment. That's exactly what Beryl Howell is talking about, that right to expression, the right to representation, which is also implicit in our Constitution. All of that undermined when a president begins to act like Dick the Butcher, act like the Queen of Hearts, and do these things that undermine the players in our system of justice. Appreciate, as always, your comments, your questions. Mark, you've been waiting on the line for a while. Appreciate your involvement with our discussion this weekend. Go right ahead.
Past, it's remarkable to me that Donald Trump is claiming the weaponization of government against him. Indeed, if the government would have been weaponized against Donald Trump, he'd be sitting in a cell of little ease someplace and contemplating his navel rather than once again being president of the United States. I mean, that he is a example of the warning that the Anti-Federalists actually gave about the presidency. They feared a a monarchical presidency. I mean, that, as I've said in the past, in Federalist 67, surrounded by minions and mistresses, and his force of janissaries ready to go out at his whim and go after his enemies. And I cannot, that Donald Trump just made it clear that he is willing to do that in pursuit of his power, and it's relatively terrifying. That
it is.
I mean, that, and what happens if Pam Bondi, that it comes before the case and there's depositions have to be given, and she's required to actually testify of what she's seen in, for example, the Epstein files, that Donald Trump did indeed abuse young girls, and that if she's called before to testify and is trapped by what is she going to say? I mean, because now she's seen the Epstein files, we're supposed to be looking at those.
Right, and in that situation and others, Mark, again, you raised some important points. When she declares, as she did just this past week, that her allegiance, not just her allegiance, but her focus is on representing this president, representing certainly his policies, his practices, but her boss she regards as the President of the United States of America, and that is her focus, on doing those things that will support his view of the world, not the views of justice as they are emblazoned once again in that building at 9th and Constitution. Mark, appreciate so much your perspective, as always, here on our broadcast, underscoring once again some of the cynicism of this, as Mark also implicitly and Gene and others have commented. The president believes that somehow we understand our system of justice to be consistent with his, where we do not have people who, under our First Amendment, come forward and articulate opposing views, that we do not have lawyers who are out there advocating, again, the adversarial system inside our courts. He apparently believes that at least a great majority of people listening to him from the Great Hall at Main Justice believe that lawyers are the problem, that the media is the problem, that people who speak up and express different views, even with ferocity and with strong vigor, that those people are undermining the basic institutions, when in fact, when they do that, they're affirming the legitimacy of the very institutions that they're invoking. And the president cynically suggesting that all of us understand a government that simply does not exist, understand his view of the government as the right one. It is not. That government view, of course, as we have been reporting here on our broadcast for a number of weeks, at least for the past couple of months, continues to focus on federal district court judges. We talked about Beryl Howell, plainly other judges who continue to say no to much of what the president has done because it is in violation of the Constitution, because it's in violation of what Congress has intended for the expenditures of monies, both overseas and domestically, because it is contrary to how the Office of Management and Budget should be operating, because it's contrary to the Merit Systems Protection Board procedures by which you can fire and otherwise pursue claims against employees if they're acting inappropriately. And that leads us to a couple of more federal district court judges. I want to focus on one in particular, one of two judges who have told Donald Trump that once again, both through the Elon Musk team and through his own machinations, his decision to hire many probationary workers across government, simply wrong, simply unsupported by the law. Another federal district court judge, his name is William Alsup, U.S. District Court in Northern California. He's a trial judge, and he is echoing the words and the orders of another of his colleague on the East Coast, finding that indeed the administration's justification for the firings of all of these probationary workers is simply unfounded. Actually called it a sham. Trump administration required now to rehire thousands of fired workers by virtue of what Judge Alsup and others have said, directing the Departments of Treasury and Veterans Affairs and Agriculture and Defense and Energy and Interior to comply with his order and offer to reinstate any probationary employees who were improperly terminated. You're wrong, Mr. President. Call them all back. He added that he was open to expanding his decision, this is the judge, to apply to other agencies where the extent of the harms had not yet been fully documented. Indeed, in the wake of his order, Judge Alsup's order of just this past week and other orders out there, the unions who've been petitioning in federal district court there filed a petition with Judge Alsup asking him to do just that, to extend the order to cover some 16 federal agencies altogether. Now, while that goes ahead, of course, the government, the Department of Justice, that we've talked about at great length on this broadcast, the Department of Justice decides it does not agree with Judge Alsop's order, and so they've taken up an appeal. And where does that go? That goes to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Why? Because California is one of the states in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the westernmost circuit court. Ultimately, that case, among all of these others, could end up at the United States Supreme Court. We'll talk about one that's already dipping its toe into Supreme Court jurisprudence in just a moment or so. This particular lawsuit and others, of course, stems from these federal employee unions that are challenging the legality of how all the agencies, at the encouragement of Musk and the White House, fired probationary employees en masse. The allegation, the civil complaint here, is that all of these actions were undertaken in a very large and overbroad sweep, and that all of these arbitrarily invoked actions ravage the federal government, demoralize the employees, and basically stop the government from working in many, many ways. Judge Alsop said that he was convinced that the federal agencies followed a directive from senior officials at the Office of Personnel Management, sometimes called OPM, that's their acronym, to use a loophole, allowing them to fire probationary employees by citing, you know this well, poor performance, regardless of their actual conduct on the job. The judge concluding that the government's actions were, as he called it, a gimmick, he said, intended to expeditiously carry out these mass firings. Noting that you're using a loophole, many of these probationary employees getting very positive reviews, even in their first year, some of them not getting any reviews at all, but nonetheless being fired based upon the notion that their performance is subpar. The judge went on to say this. He said, it's a sad day when our government would fire some good employee and say it was based on performance when they know, that is the supervisors, when the White House knows good and well that it's a lie. Here we go. It was a sham in order to try to avoid statutory requirements. Significantly, the judge, providing balance in all this, says, if it's done right, there can be a reduction in force. Nothing wrong with looking at government and figuring out where there can be some expediencies, some efficiencies promoted within an agency. That has to be true, he said. But this cannot stand. And so once again, we've got a federal district court judge, among many others nationwide, saying you can't do this. The Department of Agriculture, among other agencies, now already scrambling to try to figure out how to reinstate 6,000 probationary employees who were put on paid leave when all this happened. And one of the concerns, of course, is what will happen as these cases percolate up. Will the government, again, the Department of Agriculture, through the Secretary of Agriculture, responsible to the President of the United States of America, number one, will the president follow the rule of law, directed now by federal judges, at least two now, to pull back on these firings? Will the president say, yes, I will do just that, or will he say no, as he has in other cases, disrespecting completely the rule of law? That's when we have the constitutional crisis about which we talk, again, with regrettably increasing frequency. Will that happen? What will happen in the Ninth Circuit? Likely. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a diverse bench, but tends to be a little bit more on the so-called liberal side of the aisle, probably will support Judge Alsop when this gets to the Supreme Court. And we'll talk about one of those cases in just a moment or so. What will happen there? That is an important thing to consider, along with all of the rest of this. As all of these cases percolate up and out, we'll continue to monitor them, of course. And we're going to do in future broadcasts, we're going to revive our focus upon sort of rule of law snapshots, just giving you a general sense of where various issues stand. It is a lot, as I often say. It is difficult, if not impossible, to keep track of all this. We're going to do more of an Amicus service in the future and talk about, in a more of a rapid-fire way, some of the ways in which these cases are percolating up and through the courts of America. We'll do that in future editions of Amicus, a Law Review. We've got more on this broadcast to talk about. Stay with us. My name's Jim Santelle, your host for these remaining moments of our weekend broadcast, talking necessarily all about the federal judiciary and the ways in which many, if not all of these judges, in ways big and small, are serving as the guardrails against the unconstitutional and illegal things that are being offered, presented, being ordered by our president at this time of increasing concern about the way that our government works in service to all of us, in service to you. We know as well that one of those very early orders issued by the president on January 20th, hours after he took the oath of office at the Capitol building, was to rescind the long-standing, not just interpretation, but knowledge about what the 14th Amendment to the Constitution means, this birthright citizenship notion, this notion that the Supreme Court has previously affirmed, which is that the 14th Amendment does give people who are born in this country the right to citizenship. The president issuing an executive order, again, pursuant to another order that he would issue later on, saying, I'm the law. I can tell you what the law is in America. I'm telling you the 14th Amendment no longer establishes birthright citizenship to anyone here in our nation, and that has a dramatic impact, again, upon very many people in our nation. Well, as that case has percolated up through the courts, there are at least 3 judges, and they have been federal district court judges in Maryland, Washington, New Hampshire. You know this well. We've talked about this before. Each one of them has said, this is ridiculous. My word, not theirs. They have been even more strong in their language, setting this back and saying, no, this is not only the interpretation that is acceptable. It's contrary to the basic understandings of what the 14th Amendment was all about. You misinterpreted this, and we are telling you, you cannot enforce this executive order as to birthright citizenship, prohibiting birthright citizenship to those people who have a legitimate claim to it, have a right to it under our Constitution, since the Constitution was ratified by all of the states. 3 judges have already said just that. On Friday of just this past week, the United States Supreme Court began to tip its toe into the pool of this issue, probably the first time it's going to be involved in these cases, these executive orders, in many areas. United States Supreme Court now indicating that it will at least review preliminarily some of these orders, indicating that the president was wrong, directing that the responses from the states and groups that have challenged the constitutionality of the executive order, ending birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants and foreign residents, that they respond. They respond to an emergency request that was made by the acting Solicitor General of the Department of Justice. Yes, she's the one who now represents you in the Department of Justice for the Supreme Court. She runs to the Supreme Court and says, stop this from happening. Stop these lower court judges from telling us that the 14th Amendment means something other than what it does mean, which is we can deny birthright citizenship to the children of undocumented immigrants and foreign residents. The Supreme Court had the option to say, no, we're not doing anything here. We're letting this go ahead. We're going to let this percolate up through the appeals court. They did not do that, at least not initially. The move, nonetheless, is a signal that the justices are going to get involved in this with increasing frequency. And the justices, again, should they side with the administration, the policy could go into effect in the 28 states plus the U.S. territories that have been named as challengers to the order. The issue before the justices, again, is the legality of this tool by which a nationwide injunction has been entered by the federal district court judges. They've said that my ruling applies across the board to every single jurisdiction across the state. And the Department of Justice, the Solicitor General, is saying that's too broad. Can't do that. It should apply only to the particular plaintiffs in those cases that are challenging the executive order issued by the president. Cannot be a blanket order with respect to everyone in every state across the nation. So she's attacking it based upon the breadth of the orders being entered, but it also signals that the Supreme Court is at least interested in this issue. This is a concern. And while we'll see what happens in the weeks ahead as the parties file briefs, this is what happens when cases get to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court obviously entertains cases. They haven't formally granted certiorari on this. They're not going to review it necessarily, but at least they're considering whether or not these particular petitioners and the government, in response to what the petitioners have done, should have some day in court. That happening just this past week. The justices considering their request to lift a nationwide pause, a nationwide ban on the president's birthright citizenship order. That happening just this past week. We know about some other things the Supreme Court has done as it continues to add to its docket. It's right around 64 cases right now. They've issued about 10 orders, many of them, as you know well, coming up in May and June. We'll be reporting on all of those as well. We know that the Supreme Court already has at least one, if not two, three cases now on its docket involving LGBTQIA rights. One of those is that Scrimeti case, in which the court is going to decide whether there are the transgendered rights cases that come out of Tennessee, that is whether or not the states can prevent transgender adolescents, youth, from getting access to puberty blockers and hormone therapies. That issue already pending before the Supreme Court, argued back in December in a case called Scrimeti, having to do, again, with transgender issues. We know as well from other things we reported on here in our broadcast, Supreme Court is also looking at a case on religious objections to LGBTQIA storybooks. Some parents in Maryland, as we talked previously, are contesting a school board's refusal to notify them and to excuse their children from discussions of the storybooks, whether that violated the First Amendment rights of the parents. That case coming out of the Montgomery County Public School, Maryland, largest school system in Maryland. That case is going to be argued next month on April 22nd. The Supreme Court has now set an oral argument date on that issue, whether and how school districts can indeed have to or do not have to notify parents of the specific books that their children are reading, are reviewing, are consuming in our schools across the nation. That coming up once again on April 22nd. And yet again, just this past week, the Supreme Court adding yet another case. Supreme Court, yes, here it goes. We're going to hear a challenge to a law coming out of Colorado that bans conversion therapy. Colorado, like about 20 other states, already bars licensed therapists from trying to change the sexual orientation or the gender identity of minors in their care. Supreme Court now going to hear a challenge to that ban coming out of Colorado. No oral argument set on that yet. Reporting on that as well. All of that and more as we continue to look at the Supreme Court. We continue to look at the executive branch, and yes, indeed, one of these days, the legislature, too, should weigh in on some of these issues. We'll talk about all of it if and when they do here on Amicus, a Law Review. Have a good weekend, everybody.